Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and who's ready for some fun? I mean, I've never done an Ask JC anything before,
See,
and since it's not quite the eschaton, the original JC's not here. But you know, Dom, at Homebrewed Christianity, there are quite a few people with the initials JC who come on the podcast regularly. We got you. We got Jack Caputo,
okay,
John Cobb,
yeah,
blessed be his memory,
right.
and just Catherine Keller, because she was like, I want to be a JC. I come on a lot. And then John Dominic Crossan. So, there are only so many people that can occupy the space of a JC and answer any questions. So
now this is not Julius Caesar we're talking about.
no. I couldn't raise him from the dead either. And but, he didn't really believe in resurrection. It was more of ascension.
Right, exactly. You got him. He was on the wrong side.
And that distinction between ascension and resurrection is just one part of what we'll talk about this Lent. So anyone here that is a John Dominic Crossan fan, if you're listening to this and get intrigued, there are a few questions that touch on it, but this Lent, Dom and I are doing a course exploring Paul the Pharisee and looking at Paul in his historical context, but then taking that context to the larger conversation as a species that we're facing now. And it's going to be a lot of fun. Crossingclass.com. You can donate anything between $0 and $1 million, Dom. I said no more than $1 million. I just have standards.
So millionaires can come on if they want to.
Yeah, we might make an exception. Just email me personally. But yeah, so we're going to get to have some conversations today. We got a stack of questions that go from nerdy to personal to, maybe a screenwriter looking for your assistance. I don't know. But this is going to be a lot of fun. If you're joining live on the chat, feel free to throw in another question. Just put the word question there so we know. Because sometimes y'all just start talking to each other, which is perfectly fine. I just don't want to start reading it and then not pay attention to Dom. So, all right, Dom.
Right.
Are you ready?
I am.
Okay. All right. Let's see here. I'm gonna we'll just go with some. Here we go. Here's one. How or has your Irish Catholic heritage and experience shaped the kind of questions you bring to your research?
All right. Yes. I'm going to have to go a little bit more personal, even than Irish Catholic. I want to go back because to understand me, most of the important steps in my life have been experiential. In other words, I've not just been sitting there thinking, I wonder, something happened to me. For example, 1939, as you know, the Second World War began, at least in Europe. And that meant that my father, we had an old, well, it wasn't old then, it was a 1933 Vauxhall car. No petrol, of course. Doctors got it. My father was a banker, and bankers didn't need it. So my father and I started having long walks. I would be 8, 9, 10 years of age, 11 at the very latest, because that's where we left We go long walks on Saturday afternoon for hours, really long, along the Naas Dublin Road. That's where we were living in Kildare. And my father started to tell me about what he was interested in. And he was interested in, for example, just to take one example, he would recite poetry, no, not great poetry, rhythm and rhyme stuff that he had memorized. And I would be challenged with payments, by the way, if I could memorize the whole stuff. Now, for example, we did Coleridge's, John Masefield's marvelous poem, Cargoes. And the opening line is a quinquereme from Nineveh. A quinquereme from Nineveh, which means that I knew about Nineveh before I ever heard of Jonah, the Bible, or anything else. My father had to explain to me where Nineveh was. So years later, when I crossed the Tigris from Mosul, where I was staying, over to walk a day through the ruins of Nineveh, I wasn't confirming the Bible. I was confirming my father. That got in long before the Bible. So it's not just my Irish Catholic heritage. It's my relationship with my father and those long walks on the Naas Dublin Road. But also, of course, my Irish Catholic heritage meant that the Bible was never even mentioned. I never heard of the Bible. We had a great big book, by the way. It was called the Roman Missal, and it was just as heavy as your big Bible. But that's what I knew as an altar boy, that carrying this great big heavy missal. So by the time I came to run into the missal, that was really almost in my doctorate or even later, the missal as such. Now, the contents of the missal, of course, filled out what we spent 3 hours a day in Gregorian chant. But I didn't think of the missal. I wasn't imbued, thanks be to God, by fundamentalism. Oh, yeah, there was papal fundamentalism, of course, but we were Celtic Christianity and Rome was always far away. So I didn't know about fundamentalism. I had to learn about it. It wasn't part of my soul, and I was fighting my way out of it. I wasn't. I had heard all of that stuff. I had 5 years of Greek and 5 years of Latin at an Irish boarding school. We took all that stuff story. They were great stories. So when I eased into the Bible, there really wasn't any crisis of conscience. Of course, these were great stories. Now, I could ask myself, do I think this story is also historical? Without being, oh, I just didn't have it. I had to learn it in this country. So that's what people are saying. Oh, they're taking it all literally. How fascinating. How terribly wrong. It's like if we were in boarding school when we were reading Virgil or Homer in Greek or Latin, by the way, people were taking it literally. It never occurred to us. So all of that helped me. To use a modern term, I was vaccinated against literalism and fundamentalism by my Irish education and by my father's example.
Mm-hmm. All right. Here we go. This question right here comes from Bruce, who asks, you've talked about collaborative eschatology with God. What does that look like in practice?
All right. And quite frankly, I get an awful lot of what does that mean in practice questions. And I'm always a little bit skeptical, though please don't be offended, by thinking, well, wouldn't you want to absorb what it means first before you even get to practice? Because so often it seems to me, I'm not saying this is your intention, that the rush to practice disqualifies almost the theory. And that's its function. Let me go back. I was comparing the teaching of John the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth. And John the Baptist is talking about what I would call interventionist eschatology. That is, and I understand it, here we are now with the Roman Empire. Empires are getting stronger and worser and badder, if you will. Now we have the Roman Empire. What can we do but hope and pray and expect that God's going to come and clean up the mess of the world? It is in a mess, and it's getting messier and messier. I'm talking the first century now, not the 21st, so it's equally valid. So God's going to come and do it. We can pray, we can hope, we can expect, and maybe it'll be soon, but we are waiting for interventionist eschatology. And eschatology is simply a fancy Greek obfuscation for the mess of the world and how it's going to be cleaned up. Eschatology is a God's clean up of the mess of the world. That's what it is. Now, any day. And John the Baptist said it's imminent. And Jesus, after the death of John the Baptist, and I think the shock that God did nothing to prevent it, shifted. I think Jesus converted, if I could use a strict tense, from being an interventionist eschatologist. Try that in a sermon and lose your congregation. John the Baptist was an interventionist eschatologist. But you know what I mean. We're praying for God to do it for us. Jesus came along and said, no. And I don't think he's inventing anything because a covenant is a collaboration. It means a quid pro quo, a do it des. You do something, I do something. So collaborative eschatology is the dream of the Old Testament. It is not new to Jesus. What is new is this expectation that God's going to do it for us, which is kind of like a loss of nerve, to be certain, and maybe even a loss of faith. Because certainly the prophets, none of them thought, well, let's wait and God will do it. We will do what we can, and maybe it'll take God to finish the job. So collaborative eschatology means we are responsible for this world. Now, if you want to know what that looks like, then you're going to ask, what's the biblical God look like? That's what we're talking about. Abstract for the moment what you think of the biblical God. All right, let me put it this way. If you were imagining what God was like, forget for the moment if you don't think there is such a God. We're just imagining. What might God be like? Look at it, Genesis 1. That's what you see what God is like. What kind of a world did God create? Genesis 1 I'm talking about. We find out it's a world of justice. And by justice, we mean a fair distribution of the stuff that belongs to all of us because it was given to us by God. That's Genesis 1, 26, 27. Responsibility to run, of course. That's what it looks like in practice. It's not mysterious. We know exactly what it means, and we are working very, very carefully in the Bible, by the way. Excuse me, it starts in the Bible to make certain we don't do it. In fact, the Bible is the history of God and people, I mean by people, I mean us, struggling to avoid one another. We know exactly what the God of the Bible, stick with the God of the Bible for the moment, wants, which is a just world, a fair distribution for everyone, because everyone is part of, in the Bible, God's people. That's what it looks like. It's not like we don't know. It is precisely because we know it that we have what we call civilization, which is the massive theoretical and practical way that I keep mine and get yours. That's my definition of civilization. It's the theory and practice of keeping mine and getting yours. Or as Isaiah said, woe to you who join field to field and house to house until you live alone in the midst of the land. That's what 1% looks like around the year 700 BCE. We know exactly what it's like. That's not the problem. We don't want to do it.
Yeah. One of the other questions that came in from Nick is around the mythicist and Paul's, and he puts it this way. Well, by the way, if you send in long questions, I had to edit them short enough to show up on the screen. So since studying Paul, I've been mystified by his apparent silence on Jesus as portrayed in the Gospels. It's used by mythicists to argue against the historicity of Jesus and the gospel depictions. How do you respond to the argument from silence issue?
All right. Let me back up a little bit to myself again, autobiographically, but only in terms of academics and scholarship. As far as I am concerned, my work on Paul is part of my work on the historical Jesus. Let me be very clear to that. It's not what I've finished with Jesus. Now I'm talking about what never, ever, ever. Paul is part of the historical Jesus as far as I am concerned. I disagree profoundly with fellow colleagues who end the historical Jesus by burying Jesus. The execution of Jesus, of course, is part of the historical Jesus. So is the resurrection. If you say the resurrection never happened, fine, but the claim of the resurrection then is part of the historical Jesus. And a historian has to explain, why did they come up with that? In fact, even more so if you think it's made up. Why did they come up with that? So remember, it's part of the historical Jesus. Now, if you go back to the time before the Great War of 66 to 73, 74, we have two gospels before the foursome, as it were. That is the gospel according to Q and the gospel according to Paul. Paul calls it my gospel in the end of Romans. So we have two gospels already. The gospel according to Q has nothing about the execution and resurrection of Jesus. Nothing. Doesn't need it. It's not that it forgot about it, missed it out. Oops, forgot that one. As far as they are concerned, John the Baptist and Jesus are incarnations of wisdom. Wisdom comes down from God, incarnates in John the Baptist and Jesus. What do we do with it? We kill him. That's, it would say, is what always happens to wisdom when God offers it to the earth. Read the books of wisdom. They don't need to talk about the execution and resurrection of Jesus. Paul is the opposite. Paul, for example, who knows the prophets very well, would ask himself, let me do it this way, is Jesus saying anything new than Amos? Is Jesus saying anything new than the prophets in general? Well, then I don't know if I'm interested in talking about that. What Paul sees, and this we'll discuss far more in our, I think it comes up heavily in the fifth of our lectures, the grand finale, as it were, what Paul calls the mystery of God. And for Paul, that is, to put it bluntly, why did God allow, permit, decide, decree, choose your verb, God to send Jesus the Messiah Christ when he knew the Romans were going to crucify him? That's Paul's question. It's not my question. That's much too anthropomorphic for me. But Paul would say, God knew from all eternity what the Romans were going to be like, and God sent Jesus, the Messiah Christ, by the way, for Paul, of course, the Messiah Christ, under the Romans, knowing he was going to be executed. That's what I call the beating heart of Paul. And Paul would claim it's the beating heart of God. Why did God do that? And Paul has an answer to it, because God wanted to reveal to the nations, that's where Paul comes in, of course, to the nations, the savage heart of civilization. Roman civilization for Paul, and he would say for God, is not wrong because it's Roman, but because it's civilization. Roman civilization is simply the contemporary incarnation, let me put it, of civilization itself. And Paul would say, if you were talking to, well, we had the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks, and now we got the Romans. So same old stuff. These are like a cancer at the heart of our humanity that keeps erupting. So Paul is totally focused on, I'm trying to imagine, I want to say two words at the same time: execution, revelation, execution, resurrection. I know I have to say execution and resurrection, but could you think of those as two sides of the same coin and realize that we are incapable of seeing simultaneously in synchronicity, in singularity, the two sides of a coin. We have to have heads, tails. Now, Paul would imagine God, of course, can see the two sides of a coin simultaneously. So, execution, resurrection. So, for Paul, that is the heart of the matter. The teaching of Jesus, he says, is very nice, very good. Of course, we take that for granted. But it's not new. What is new is the Messiah Christ. And this would bring in, of course, the nonviolence of Jesus, because Pilate doesn't round up his followers, which he would do if Jesus was violent. That's an aside. The execution of Jesus is the revelation to the nations, because they're the ones that need it. The revelation to the nations of the savage heart of civilization. And then, of course, resurrection is the counter revelation of the justice of God. So that's Paul. And if our understanding of execution has been destroyed, thank you, Anselm of Canterbury, for doing that to us, by thinking of vicarious atonement and other bad theology. Let me make it simple. Jesus was executed legally, publicly, formally, legally by Rome, whose vaunt was, "We have brought you people law and order, justice and peace, Roman civilization, the glory of the world." And it executed the Messiah Christ, and God knew it. That's the heart of Paul. The heart of Paul is not about circumcision or something else. These are important items. But the heart of Paul is the execution and resurrection. That's the historicity of Jesus. It's not about something else. So this idea of taking Paul apart from Jesus destroys the very heart of Christian theology. It's bad theology, and all religions I know have their own bad theology.
Yeah.
Ours happens to be vicarious atonement. Okay.
Well, when you think about the mythicists in general, do you want to say something? Because I've only been present when I saw Dale Allison respond to the question of mythicists and asked a very similar question, and he was just like, if you take the most authoritative Pauline text, he's obviously talking about a real person, two other people that knew him historically. His identity's threatened. He makes reference to the role and function of the disciples, that his authority is challenging them, and he's collecting for the community in Jerusalem. If he was inventing it, that would be a rather useless thing to do. He mentions directly the Last Supper, and focuses most of his time on the execution and resurrection, because that's what he actually understands as the unique contribution of the Christ event to his Jewish faith.
Yeah.
But that's the only time I've seen other New Testament scholars take seriously the mythicist charge, like within the guild. Like, how do you see that thesis existing?
And to be honest with you, it's not something I would really want to debate on a stage with somebody in the same way, because I think I would lose. How can you prove somebody said didn't happen? If you'd lose a debate maybe with people who deny the Holocaust too. It didn't happen. So everything you say, including those arguments that Dale just used, well, they're all invented. There's the story of Paul escaping from the Nabateans at Damascus, which is exactly the historical point of 36 CE, when the Nabateans first grabbed Damascus. It fits perfectly into that historicity. Oh, but they invented that. Everything is invented. So if somebody wants to think that, I would say, fine, you have every right to be wrong. I honestly would lose a debate, because I don't know how to if everything you can say is wrong. But it makes, honestly, absolute sense to me when I read Paul talking about the mystery of God from all eternity. God knew something. What did he know? He knew that the Messiah Christ was going to be crucified, and he sent him into it. He sent him straight into the, shall we say, the chainsaw of Roman imperial power.
Mm-hmm. All right. Here's a fun question from Janine. If you were to outline a more historically accurate Jesus film, how would you do it?
Okay.
Though it'd be
First
really
of all,
hard to top Life of Brian.
okay, yes. Yeah, I mean, the Life of Brian is clearing away the debris of bad theology. Okay, now with that done, the first thing I would say is it's going to be called Judas. I'm going to take Judas very seriously. And I'm going to be picking up the question that the New Testament in its various ways asks, why does Judas betray Jesus? You know, there's Paul's answer and all the rest of it. I have John's answer, I'm sorry. I would say, okay, what's really going on is whether you resist the Romans violently or non-violently. That's the issue we're going to talk about. That's the issue behind the movie. Jesus is for non-violence. How do I know that historically? Because he's executed by Pilate and his closest followers aren't rounded up and executed with him, like happens for Barabbas and company in that Markan parable. So the Romans, when you were a violent leader, they grabbed as many of your close lieutenants as they could and put them up in a nice row. So you get the idea, as they did, as you know, with Spartacus all the way from Capo to Rome. So people get the idea, oops, that's what happens. Now, when the Romans were confronted with somebody in their language who created a tumult among the people, who created maybe a riot in the city, what did they do with that person? They crucified that person. They didn't bother with the rest of the followers because they thought it would just disappear. So, for example, that's why they crucified Jesus. Now, I would start with Judas, and I would put Judas plausibly in the sense of, well, this is crazy. This is simply stupid. How are you going to defeat the Romans with nonviolent resistance? And all of this is in Josephus, so I'm not making it up, by the way. So I would start off with Judas maybe involved in the first war against Rome. I think I call it the War of 4 BCE, and losing that. And so he's wondering now, along comes 6 CE and the census, and he sees nonviolent resistance, starting with the fourth philosophy, which I would start around the year 600. So he has Jesus talking about nonviolence, and Judas is talking about violence, and he hopes, well, maybe this will work. And as it's not working, he finally, this is not original, he betrays Jesus, so it'll be, Jesus will have to, because God's not going to allow Jesus to be executed. So I'll turn him over, and then he'll finally be forced either to bring down the angels or something. I do it in terms of the theology of the time, but incarnated in Judas. And then you can turn out Mary the Magdalene. She has to be in there because she's important, and Peter. So those would be the 4 major characters I'd have in the story: Judas, Jesus, Mary the Magdalene, and Peter. And I work it like that. And the validity of that is, even the New Testament is always somebody talking about Jesus. And, you know, if you want to say, well, what about the miracles? What about that could be a dream of Peter. Give Peter a dream where he's walking on the waters, because that proves he's more important than anyone else, which is good Petrine theology. Sure, dream. But Jesus is a healer, by the way. Make no mistake about that, and however you explain it. He's a healer. Whether he's a curer is a separate issue.
Awesome. Wasn't there when Jesus was young, if he's growing up near Sepphoris, wasn't there like a big execution where a couple thousand people got put on crosses?
Yeah, and I've often thought about that. In 4 BCE, I mentioned that the first war against Rome, and it is a war. It's a war whenever the legions march. The legions came down from their bases just south of Antioch. There was, I think, 4 legions stationed there to guard the Euphrates frontier. When they have to come south, all hell is going to break loose because they're coming south to teach you people a lesson so we don't have to come back again for 50, 60 years. So the legions came down in 4 BCE. And Josephus says on the way down, because they always come down through the Galilee, of course. On the way down, they attacked Sepphoris and burned it to the ground. That's Josephus now.
Mhm.
Okay. Nazareth is one of the adjacent villages. The question I've always asked is, as Jesus was growing up, born around the time of that, let's say, what did he hear about the Romans? And I asked that question from my background of growing up in Ireland. What did we hear about the British? And I'm talking about songs.
Mhm.
As we grew up as kids, we had the history, of course, and that was boring. But all the songs we had were songs of rebellion. We were still living 1798 over and over again in magnificent rebellion songs. And they were great songs, by the way. Make no mistake about it. I still remember them today, the words of them. In the Scot he's in flames and old Wexford is done and tomorrow the barrow we cross. And they're all failures. They all end up in disaster until the last one that doesn't. So I feel very at home with the Jewish people doing the same thing. But when this happens, I mean, you're watching this. And I think Jesus must have grown up knowing all about the Romans. There weren't mythical beasts over there that you've heard about. He grew up, as I grew up in Ireland, with the British gone, but we could still blame them for everything. So I grew up in the first marvelous generation when you're free, but close enough so it's their fault for everything that's going wrong. Now, by the second or third generation, you run your own country and you can't keep blaming them anymore. So I understood, what did Mary say to Jesus? I'm saying that because I'm not sure his father, Joseph, is still alive. He may have been killed in 4 BCE. In any case, what would he have been told about the Romans? And did nobody ever ask, and Jesus never hear, where was God the day the Romans came? I cannot imagine him growing up without hearing that question. Where was God when the Romans came through? All of us at Nazareth who weren't able to hide in the caves all over Galilee. Our men would have been slaughtered, our women raped, and our children enslaved.
Yeah.
Where was God? The God of the Bible who does this and that and the other. I think Jesus grew up with that. It's not somebody at the age of 30 saying that, I wonder what's God up to. He was ripe, first of all, for John the Baptist, and then at the death of John the Baptist for a conversion. That's not the way God operates.
Yeah. You could the thing about, that historically that would be just, I think, rather powerful in a film is, some way that you get a flashback at some point to Jesus and Joseph with, either walking by crosses that have decayed or telling the story. And Joseph has a kind of protest to, like, this isn't how it's supposed to be, right? Like, he's voicing to his son a protest that then Abba has a response to, and you see that, like, it's like a flashback during the baptism where you get, like, this is my son. It flashbacks, son, this is not how it's supposed to be, to Joseph. And then when you play out this kind of like imagining what it means to be the Christ in the temptations, the rejection of bowing the knee and becoming the emperor, or performing this stunt off the temple, is a rejection of civilization, a rejection of, this isn't how we build the world God wants. And with that, if you use the Joseph Jesus relationship and then Jesus and Abba kind of thing, you can see how that experience with John and his memory of his father kind of like occasion this embrace of the fourth philosophy, nonviolence.
The only change I would make, despite what I said about my own relationship with my own father, I go with Mary, because there's enough little wisps of evidence that somehow Joseph isn't around, and it's not because of the virginal conception or any of that theological metaphor. it has to do with Mary. See, he's the son of Mary. Why is he the son of Mary? Is Joseph so long gone? Not just gone like yesterday, but so long gone that he's not even in memory almost. So if I was doing it as a movie where I'd be able to fill in the gaps, I'd have Joseph caught at Sepphoris.
Oh, good.
He works maybe at Sepphoris, and I don't consider Jesus or his father, depending on whether you're going with Mark or Matthew, as carpenters in our sense of the word. I would consider them day laborers. I think that would be the best translation I would do of tecton, with the connotation that seemed to have when Matthew and Luke read Mark and say, we don't want to say Jesus was a tecton. So Matthew said, well, his father was a tecton. And Luke said, let's not talk about that. So I think tecton in Mark embarrasses Matthew and Luke. And therefore, I would presume Jesus and his father before, more likely, were day laborers.
Well, mentioning Sepphoris there actually connects to one of the other questions. Over the years, what have been the archaeological discoveries which most informed your scholarship or changed your mind about something?
Okay, archaeological discoveries. Let me mention one which isn't an archaeological discovery in a way at all. Well, as you probably noticed, I try to begin with history. Now, I can't let on I don't know, of course, the story of Jesus. Of course, I know the story. But when I'm trying to start with, say, with the world of Jesus or the life of Jesus, say with the classes that we've done last year or the year before with Trip for Easter, I try to ask, what is the thickest, most complete imagination I have of Galilee before I bring Jesus into the matrix? In other words, of course, I can't let on I don't know all sorts of stuff. But let me put that aside for a moment and say, what is Antipas up to? Antipas changes his capital from inland Sepphoris to lakeside Tiberias around the year 20, because his first coins come out in the year 19, let's say, 24th year of his reign. What's he up to? Forget Jesus for a moment, please. What is he up to? Because you really don't change your capital. I'm sorry for using Aramaic. It pisses off everyone. It really does. You want to get everyone really mad at you. Everyone. From the aristocrats who are going to have to sell a used villa. What's the price of my used villa? I'm an elite member of the court and I have to go, of course, to Tiberias. And of all the places, a lakeside, mosquitoes, malaria. No wonder Jesus spends his whole life healing. It's all chronic malarial diseases he's in with. Nazareth, up in the Nazareth Ridge, up at Sepphoris, nice up above the valley. Good breeze up there, by the way. It's quite lovely. Probably no mosquitoes, I would imagine, at least then. So why would you do that? It really, really, really annoys everyone. Well, he wanted to call it after Tiberius, the new emperor. He could do that by changing the name of Sepphoris and putting up a nice big triumphal gate or a new stadium or lots of ways. You don't change your capital's location. And if he does it, why there? Now, those are the historical questions. And what you do is not try to read the mind of Antipas, you watch his actions. What's he up to? And you watch the fact that he tried to become king of the Jews, almost made it under Augustus in what, 4 BCE. He tried again under Caligula in what, 39, and didn't make it then. So I'm imagining that Antipas is the one who wants to be king of the Jews like daddy, king of the Jews. How am I going to become king of the Jews? Now I'm reading what he did. If I changed my capital to Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee becomes the Lake of Tiberias, and I commercialize the lake. I take over the fishing commons. There was commons, so people could go out there, and if they had a net, they could grab a fish, and if they had a boat or bunch of families could get a boat and go out. I'm commercializing the lake, and my fish will go into my fish factories, and they'll be salted, or they'll be dried, or we make garum or whatever, and we ship it straight to Tyre and into Mediterranean globalization, which is what Roman imperialism is really about. It's not about just getting a nice ring of Roman stuff all around the Mediterranean so it looks nice on a map. We're after Mediterranean globalization. That's what we're into. And I, Antipas, I'm getting with the program. No, the commons is closed. And if you know history, the commons, closing down the commons, or Sherwood Forest, or whatever else you want, that's dynamite. Because people know, wait a minute, this is not right. Now, into that matrix maelstrom comes Jesus. And he has traction. He's not really saying anything except what the prophets have always said. This is not just, but they have a specific moment. They know this is not just because their families are hurting. They used to be able to go down from small peasant holdings, go down to the lake and get some protein additive for supper. Now, who was able to change that? That's time immemorial. So it had to be set up by God, which goes along with the prophets. And along comes Jesus and says, this Roman imperialism and Antipas's participation in it is not just. And if you want to know what it looks like, look at what's happening. Now, that's the flashpoint. It's the traction that gives the tradition explosive power. If you don't have traction, your tradition may be magnificent, but it's like, if I may quote Shakespeare, it gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Oh, yeah, that's how it works. And that, if I may make a comment, is what the Democrats better learn. You have to have traction, and the traction has to be as big as you can get if the program is big. So that's what I really see. And I want to start always with history. And that means some work. I'm sorry. Would I just soon start with Jesus, and Jesus called the fishermen and they gave up everything and went with him because that was Jesus? Maybe it was personality. Maybe it was divine will. No, that's why there's so much fishy stuff in the gospel. That's why Jesus leaves inland Nazareth and goes to Capernaum. He's tracking exactly what happened from Sepphoris to Tiberias. He's going where the action is. That's where the action is. That's where the traction for God's rule against Rome's rule comes down to who owns the fishes. That makes sense to me. And if you say, well, you mean it's not about, of course it's about God. It's about who runs this world, the biblical God or the Roman God. Now, if you want to debate about God, be very careful that you're not avoiding the issue, which is who's running the lake. So if all of the people listening to Paul said, tell us about God, I think Jesus would have told them a parable to get them off it and get them back to what he's talking about.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to try to avoid asking follow-ups since people sent lots of questions.
Okay.
And we have a whole bunch of live Q&As throughout Lent, so I'm sure I'll ask all the things I want to ask then. Here's a fun one. How do different historians get such different pictures of Jesus? What decisions do people like Ehrman or Wright, I guess Bart Ehrman or N.T. Wright, make that you don't? It's helpful there, right? Because, Ehrman's not making it from a confessional space, and N.T. Wright is. But for people that maybe, end up reading the kind of different accounts of the historical Jesus, what are the different moves historians are making that can help, someone trying to learn it secondhand make distinctions?
Okay, it really depends where you want to start. I mean, we all have to agree that we know about Jesus. We can't let on. We really are surprised when he gets himself executed. We know the story. Now, my way of trying to do it, And it just simply tracks with my own experience, I suppose, that I didn't grow up with the Bible. I mean, again and again, I want to keep saying that. So I don't really start there. Again, let me go back to my father. He graduated from high school from St. Eunan's College, that I would later be as a boarder. He was there as a day boy. And that must have been 1922. And he was enthralled by Ura the Chaldees, which had just been excavated, and Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings. He told me all about that stuff again on those long walks because they had fired his imagination. Now he was an armchair geographer, as it were. So I knew all that stuff again. Now, I began with that stuff because it was in there, not because I was brilliant or anything else. I began with that stuff. And I had 5 years, as you know, of Greek and Latin. And I was reading home because everyone was doing that, not because I was brilliant. I went to a classic boarding school because that's the one that happened to be there. The British were gone, but they'd left behind a magnificent education system. That's where we got it. Pure, in a way you could call it, coincidence. Nothing to do with I was really smart, so I went. Absolutely not true. So I came in that way. So my native way of approaching it when I see anything is the matrix. What's the historical situation, sociological, anthropological, in terms of this? What's going on? Now, if you come in some other way, you can pretty much get any Jesus you want, because first of all, we have 4 according tos. There is nothing as honest as the fact that the titles given to them are the gospel according to. And a gospel, first of all, is the interpretation, because to say something is good news is to interpret it. If you say X is the president, that's good news. Okay, it could be, but that's an interpretation. Could be valid, could be not. And according to is a kind of interpretation of an interpretation. All of that is honest, open and honest. Now, if you come in through history, you can use it to ask, for example, if you want, behind these 4 vectors of according tos and good news, what do I see there about a guy whom some people wanted to follow, if not worship, and other people wanted to reject, if not crucify? That's what I have to explain historically. So I don't know if I'm just gifted by the accidents of my personal history that I came in from the point of view of history. Before I knew it was history, I don't want to make it sound as later I understood, but I simply came in knowing Virgil already and loving the stories of Virgil. They're great stories. And I can't say, did we as kids in school, 14, 15, did really ever say to another, did those gods and goddesses trampling around windy Troy, were they real? And we were taught by priests, and the priests never said to us, now don't believe all this stuff about Athena. They never did it. So I was inoculated, vaccinated by a prophylaxis against literalism and fundamentalism before I ever knew the words. And that's what makes me different. It doesn't make me right. It just makes me different. Of course, it makes me right too, but
so in contrast, both Bart Ehrman and N.T. Wright both have a kind of American, not American, but a more evangelical upbringing. So they encountered Jesus in the Gospels first, as opposed to a prayer book and history text in your experience. So like when you think of the different elements that historians use, say like, E.P. Sanders' list of here are the events we more or less can agree on, or how you understand, prioritize different texts, like how you might date Q, Thomas, Mark, these kind of things, or what role the Roman context plays or the Jewish context plays, or how you understand Jesus in contrast to John when it goes to eschatology and such. Like, what are those? What elements of those do you think are the ones when reading different scholars to pay attention to to see kind of like, oh, well, here is the historical decisions a scholar's making that ultimately kind of like this is where they're weighting the evidence that sets up their larger kind of historical construct.
Let me see. I will say this, if it could be said. I still think that Barth is fighting his way out of fundamentalism, because I really see, and by the way, I distinguish between literalists and fundamentalists. A literalist is somebody who takes a text literally, could be right or wrong. A fundamentalist is somebody who says, if you don't take it literally, you're not a Christian or you're not right. That's it. Those are different things. In other words, I can't really debate with a fundamentalist, because what he thinks about me, I know. And I don't think the same thing about him. I just think he's wrong. Now, there may be results that comes from that wrong that'll make people suffer, but that's a separate issue. I think Barth is fighting his way out of fundamentalism. I think he's still stuck in LaSalle Street in Moody Bible Institute, because that got in first. How can he not? And I think that Tom has the same stuff, but he loves it. So if in one sense, both of them take stuff too literally, Barth rejects it, Tom accepts it. My problem is they're both taking stuff literally. My challenge is quite clear. Resurrection is a metaphor. Metaphors create reality when they are lived. If you live according to the cosmic justice, which is what resurrection is about, according to Paul, then you change the world. Is resurrection real? Of course it's real. Did it happen on the morning that Jesus came out of the tomb and said, "Hi, I'm back"? No. No. But if you start to see the world, that's the meaning of what happened, then you change the world. So if I were to say, and if I was debating with them, I would say, let's talk about history. Now, Tom might say, well, resurrection is an historical event for me. I would say I don't see the evidence for that, because in every other case of the life of Jesus, the incident is explained. Show me in the New Testament where the moment of resurrection, not the effects, consequences, visions, or even empty tomb. How does that get you to resurrection? At the very, very, very most, it could get you to his ascension as an interpretation, because you have to interpret. You can't just say resurrection as if that explains. So I would demand again, I'm again historian, tell me what resurrection meant in the first century and to Paul. That's where we start. We don't start with, I don't believe in the resurrection. You believe in the resurrection? How do you know what it meant? Why do we presume we know exactly what it meant? So, as I've been insisting in recent years, there's a difference between ascension and resurrection. There's a difference between the Western and the Eastern vision of Easter in iconography. What does that tell us? Those are historical, I'm going to say, facts.
Yeah. I think that's hopeful. And even, I mean, the kind of autobiographical way you started the context is helpful, because I know when you've shared that before, people go, "Oh, I don't even know what it would be like to pick up one of the Gospels and not have my Sunday school teacher in the back of my head." And that just wasn't your context, so it sets up a different question. And just like that, oh, we're going to argue about the resurrection. So many times people are set arguing about a concept's veracity without understanding the concept in its historical context, which is something everyone will get to talk about. There's a whole lecture on it in our class this Lent. John, who is a current MDiv student at Luther Seminary, asked, what is your reflection on the work of the Jesus Seminar? This is a longer version of the question where he talks about, looking at the sayings and that kind of thing, and the voting. Do you think the process of including down to the percentage is a helpful way to think about Scripture? And later in the question, he asked, what are your overall reflections from that time with the Jesus Seminar?
Okay. Now, I happen to have here, because I've just got it, the last, I don't think, oh yeah, you can see it without, look at the last exam. Is it, I don't know if it's showing up.
A little bit of it. It looks very mysterious.
All right. This is the last issue of the West Stars, the fourth R. On the outside of it is the image of Tekla, but I have the article in there that I have that answers the question. I'm not just pushing him off on it, but the article is called, not quite grammatical, The Jesus Seminar and Me, an interview with John Dominic Crossan. So if he's interested in really getting more detail that we can do here, then please go and get a copy of the fourth hour or subscribe to the fourth hour from the West Hour Institute and read the article. Now, in answer to it, here is what is absolutely rock bottom essential. The reason when Bob Funk asked me to be co-chair, and he's the founder, I'm the co-chair, what I accepted absolutely from Bob is that it is not right, and by right I mean morally, ethically right, for us scholars to be doing all our research and publishes it in journals which are footnoted half the page to make certain that no normal human being will ever read it. So as long as we stay inside the SBL, in our meetings and everything else, and in our learned journals, we can say anything. We can discuss that Jesus exists even. But don't come out into the streets and scare the horses. So what I believe in absolutely, and still do, it is not right not to tell people what's going on. It's like if doctors decided when they find out about germs and microbes, don't tell people about that. They won't believe there's stuff we can't see. So let's just say, oh, the person the air is bad for them. And then suddenly it comes out about microbes. And of course, people are annoyed and mad and being treated like idiots. So I agree absolutely with the Jesus Seminar program, which is to publicize our research. Now, is the best way to do that by focusing on the sayings? That was what Bob wanted to, and I was quite happy to go along with it. It's not, if you look at my book from 1991, it's called The Historical Jesus, the Life of a Mediterranean Jewish Peasant. Life, not the sayings. And that doesn't dismiss anything we were doing. We were focusing on the sayings. I was not focusing on the sayings. I say again, Mediterranean Jewish peasant. That's the matrix coming into it. In fact, somebody demanded their money back from Harper San Francisco. They said it's page 253 before we ever meet Jesus. Yeah, because that was therapy, if you will, prophylaxis. You have to begin with the matrix. So I was interested in the historical matrix as the way you begin, not in the sayings. But I was perfectly happy to work on the sayings because that was necessary too. But I didn't get to the importance of Jesus' sayings except through history, not through kind of distilling them, which is perfectly valid, by the way, because you have to do a triage on the sayings, the events, and everything else about Jesus. There's some goes back to let us say, the 20s. Some of it comes from the tradition, working on what Jesus says and applying it. Some comes from the evangelists, like Matthew and Luke, reading Mark and saying tecton. No way. Not a carpenter, as we say. So you have to do triage if you're honest. And if somebody says that everything Jesus says, Jesus said, that's just not true. And everything that happened to Jesus, that's not true. And when you're reading the crucifixion of Jesus, which is true, it is not accurate history. For example, what Jesus said in his last words, that's why he has different last words in each gospel. So yes, you have to discriminate between what happened, what, how would I put it, explains what happens by giving you more details. We're going to describe the crucifixion and we're going to explain the meaning of it by having Jesus die in the tissue of resonances from all the slaughtered and persecuted ones of Israel. So he will die crying out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Because he's not dying alone. He's not the first Jew who dies on a Roman cross, nor the last one. He doesn't die alone. That's the glory of the crucifixion accounts. Everything that happens there is putting Jesus into the matrix of Jewish persecutions. So he doesn't die alone, and therefore, of course, he doesn't rise alone. So the idea of Jesus coming out of the tomb all by himself is utterly unbiblical. Anyway, all right. I got off on it. I hope I answered the question somewhere in there.
All right, here's a fun one. Andrea asks, "What's your favorite class and book to teach?" Because you're a professor emeritus, so when you think back to all the time in the classroom, and you're looking at a syllabus, what's the favorite title of the class on top? And if you're rolling through the assigned text, which was your favorite one to get to read with students?
Oh, once again, you're dreaming of me. I spent most of my years at DePaul perfectly happy teaching 40-person classes of general education on comparative religion or the history of religions. I didn't have the luxury. I say that now, I'm not being quite sincere. I never taught doctoral students and only rarely even touched on master level students. I didn't have that, which meant, now to be fair, that gave me huge time to do my own work. If I was teaching doctoral students and helping them with their doctoral thesis and having to read all sorts of materials that I might or might not have been interested in, I wouldn't have been able to focus. So I love the combination of teaching, maybe 3 classes, 40 students in each class, starting at 8:30 in the morning. There were hour and a half classes on Tuesday and Thursday, being finished by 1:30. I didn't take a break, but I took a 10-minute break between them. 3 in a row, Tuesdays and Thursdays. I love the combination because teaching undergraduates is high performance. I mean, you have to keep moving all the time, so they never know where you are and can't fall asleep. So I love the combination of teaching undergraduates, but I was teaching introduction to religion, general religion, comparative religion. Only rarely would I get, if I wanted to, teach a course on the historical Jesus, and I probably wouldn't do it because I might get 10 students. I much prefer the security of 40 students when I could pretty much get my own schedule. So if I was teaching a book now, what I would love to do is teach our book, Resurrecting Easter, Sarah and my book, Resurrecting Easter. But I would want to be in a classroom with a great big screen, and I would project the book. We wouldn't have copies. Well, if you want to have copies, you can get Kindles. I wouldn't get the tabletop the copy. I would project onto a screen and ask people to look at this Western image of Jesus coming out of the tomb, alone, gorgeous, triumphant, but alone. Well, the soldiers are there, they're either seeing or sleeping. Now look at the Eastern one here. Just look at it. Jesus is coming out and he's carrying a cross, which is a bit awkward, by the way, and he's got wounds showing, and he's coming out of Hades, not hell. He's coming out of the place of death for the human race. That's where we all go. And he's taking Adam and Eve out by the hand. Now, just tell me what that means. Don't tell me you believe it or not. Adam and Eve represent the human race. So if I were to show you an image of 2 yellow arches, you'd know what they mean. And then you could tell me what I like or I don't like McDonald's. Fine. By all means. Like it or not, but you know what it means. Now, tell me what this means. Jesus holding his cross, and clearly the crucified one, the executed one, takes Adam and Eve by the hand and raises them from the prison house of death. Just tell me what it means. Then we can decide I reject it or accept it. So I'd want to get them to think. And I want them to think with images so they couldn't get around it. So the language couldn't get mushy, or, you wouldn't know quite what things mean. I want them to tell me what that means. And then we will discuss, do you think it's rubbish? Or do you accept it? Do you think we should try and live by it? Does it mean that we're all home free? There's no hell? But wait a minute, this isn't about hell. This is about Hades. And Hades is like Sheol, the place of death. So I'd love them to look at images and to think. Now, of course, we bring in text as well. Of course.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd really like to teach a book in which they'd have to work with images. And as you well know, Trip, that's why we do our classes with images. Because I want people to have an image in their mind that they can't get away with, of good old Caesar, half dressed because he's God. It's so hard to remember to put on your clothes when you're divine.
Well, he's right over your shoulder, Dom.
You can see him, So I want to get that image in people's minds so that they can't get away from it.
Well, I had a weird dream the other day. Dom and I have been recording all the lectures for the class, so they'll all be up before Ash Wednesday, so you can use them at whatever time if you're doing with the group and such. And I had a dream that we did an intensive class together in the city of Rome. And because you took us in the class, you take us around Rome, and went to the altar of peace, like all those different places, and in my head, we had a group, and we're going around Rome and doing like both the like the theology of Rome, and then time in Paul in relationship to Rome. We were going through all this kind of stuff, and doing that's great. Showing pictures is one thing. Walking around the altar of peace with you, getting I was just like, this is great. And then you get Italian food at night for the debrief. So I was just sitting there going like, oh man. And if I got to invent a class, I'd be like, well, I think Dom and I need a co-teach in Rome. Mostly just so I get to hang out with him and Sarah in Rome. And also Papa Francis showed up for to hang out with us. So when you're dreaming, go big. Yeah, he showed up and was like, Dom, I don't want you to tell anyone, but I am a big fan of your work. And
that book I just mentioned, Resurrecting Easter, that's got to be in the Vatican Library, because when you get manuscripts from the Vatican Library and pay for them and everything to put in your book, you have to promise to send a copy of the book to the Vatican Library. So they got it. I hope they have it in there.
Well, we need to wrap up, but there were some questions I know come up in the are going to come up in lectures, so I didn't want you to have to give a short answer to something you spent time on. But there were a number of them that talked about that asked questions about how you see the hearing Paul and the message of Jesus in the context of evolution, and they were asking these questions. And Monday, Dom and I were talking about him coming to hang out with everyone this year in October, that both he and Sarah are going to get to come to Theology Beer Camp, which is the big homebrewed event, 600 people hanging out. And we had an idea. We had an idea for a little special session. So I'm like 95% sure it's going to work. So maybe that could be the lure. If you like asking the questions of how Paul's vision of the cosmos in relationship to the resurrection and our current challenges relates to the larger cosmos, then Dom and I were talking, we had an idea, and through the power of texting my friends, I think it's going to happen.
I give one more hint on that. We might even call it, I don't know about this, honestly, I didn't talk to you. We might call it the birthing of creation, because I'd ask you, just as a departing, to read Romans 8:22 and notice that Paul is talking about creation, which I thought was kind of in the biblical sense, all set up back there in the beginning, as a birthing process. That sounds awful like evolution to me. An ongoing growing, not groaning, in pain, someone groaning as a birthing process. So that's what we have to really think about for the future, the relation between the biblical creation account and evolution. Evolution as it's known to the scientists.
Yeah.
That's unfinished business.
Yeah. And so our idea is that Dom was going to be working on a new lecture about the groaning of creation, and how the biblical story kind of opens it up. And then, which I'm not going to announce anyone else coming to camp, but one of my friends who's big deal in science and religion is going to take the same prompt but address it from the cosmological story, like through the scientific account of the cosmos. And then we get to hear them both talk about the resonance between how Paul kind of frames our history and the invitation to resist civilization and build build a future, and then and how an account of the cosmos scientifically does. So if you are a theology nerd, I could not imagine something more enticing. But I'm in charge of the event, so obviously I'm going to find what happens there enticing. But anyway, you can check that out. Theologybeer.camp is where you can get info. And if you're on here, you're the first people to know that Dom and Sarah are coming. And they do have high quality projection and screen. So the excellent imagery that Sarah provides for your visual lectures, we'll get to see the Crossan dynamic duo. Not just in person, but in optimal with optimal viewing. So super, super pumped, Dom.
Thank you very much. And remember, excuse me, remember Paul talks twice about a new creation. The only term nobody else uses it. And remember, when the new creation is coming, the old creation will not be happy. So if you want to watch what the old creation is like in responding to the new creation, well, look around.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dom. Thank you, all of you that have joined live and listening later. And we hope you come join us and a bunch of other people this Lent as we look at Paul the Pharisee. You can head over to crossanclass.com where you can sign up, do it yourself, meet people online, do it with a group. And all the visual lectures will be available before it starts, so you can watch them at your own pace or use them in a group. And then each week, we'll have a live stream where we'll be doing some Q&A on each of the lectures. So as you're watching them and such, make sure you write down your questions, send them our way, and we'll get to have some fun. So until next time, friends.
Thank you.
Peace.